the liberalism of the early to mid-1960s, and the U.S. government's increasing involvement in U.S. social issues prompted a wave of social movements during the period. Using the civil rights movement as a model, other organizations formed to advocate for their own rights and issues within the United States. At the same time, as President Lyndon Johnson increased America's direct involvement in the ongoing Vietnam conflict, Americans mobilized to criticize the government's policies. As with the civil rights movement, young people were the primary advocates of the decade. The large baby boom demographic who increasingly entered college during this period took up the challenge of the Kennedy administration to take a more active role in American society. As the decade continued on, however, many of those same young people grew disillusioned by the continued issues impacting the United States, along with the greater numbers of non-college youth mobilized to fight in Vietnam. From their perspective, the rhetoric that had inspired them no longer matched the reality of life in the United States. The various social movements of the United States in the 1960s, and in other countries around the world during this period, are often placed under the umbrella of the term, the New Left. The New Left describes a number of different organizations, each with their own different interests, with their own individual agendas and objectives, although sometimes their interests overlapped. However, the New Left organizations did share some similarities: a desire for social and economic equality among Americans, and frustration with the slow pace of change the country through the actions and inaction of the federal government. These groups argued that despite some improvements, the government was not acting quickly enough or in response to what the American people really wanted. In time, New Left groups will see the federal government not as an ally for change, but rather an obstacle to their goals. The government, they argued, was an entity controlled by the rich and powerful machine, called the establishment, or in the slang of the 1960s, the man. Politicians were more concerned with increasing their bank accounts than they were with improving the lives of Americans. The traditional method that Americans relied upon for change in the U.S., electing representatives who would listen to constituents and pass laws for the benefit of their constituents, was broken, New Left organizations began to argue. Only through direct action would politicians listen to the voice of the people. Borrowing the strategies of the civil rights movement, New Left organizations used direct action to bring attention to their causes. Picketing, sit-ins, protests, boycotts, and other methods would grab the government's attention and pressure politicians to enact change. The Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS, was a New Left organization that grew in prominence during the 1960s. The SDS initially formed on college campuses to support the civil rights movement and take part in protests. As the Vietnam War escalated, and larger numbers of college-aged students entered military service in the 1960s, the SDS would go on to not just concern themselves with civil rights but to protest U.S. involvement in the conflict overseas. A core principle of the SDS was that American society remained unequal despite the advantages that millions of Americans enjoyed. Segregation still dominated the South and, by the mid-1960s, working-class Americans were being drafted for a conflict overseas. On top of that, the world regularly contended with the fear of nuclear war between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Increasingly, the movement believed that the U.S. government, the entity with the power to solve these issues, and others, took little interest in doing so. Instead, the SDS argued, the U.S. government was more responsive to corporate and moneyed interests than to the people they should represent. In 1964, SDS leadership met at a home in Port Huron, Michigan, to draft a statement reflecting their core principles. In addition, the Port Huron Statement, as the document came to be called, explained the SDS strategy to advocate for change in a country where politicians did not seem to listen. The SDS argued that the most effective strategy to force needed changes to American society was through the use of participatory democracy. This idea encouraged people to get directly involved in the decisions that impact their lives. All Americans need to take full responsibility and to do their part to make the change take place, in other words, to quote, give power to the people. Through this process, citizens worked with politicians to solve issues and make decisions. And to bring attention to the issues that the SDS believed to be problems within the United States, and to gain the attention of politicians, the organization advocated for direct action measures much like those civil rights protesters used. The SDS grew increasingly vocal in protest of the Vietnam War. As more and more draftees entered service, those who remained behind, especially college students, saw themselves as having a special place in order to protest the Vietnam War. College students were exempt from the draft. They remained safe and secure while other people their own age who didn't get the chance to go to college were getting drafted and going to fight in the war. The SDS, and other organizations as well, believed it was their responsibility to protest the war on behalf of those who had been drafted and didn't have a voice. The U.S. government had little cause to end the war according to the SDS, as the Cold War and containment dominated their thinking. At the same time, corporations profited from continued military spending. Under such circumstances, politicians had little interest in de-escalating the Vietnam War. In response, the SDS used direct action methods like protests and sit-ins to gain attention. The organization was very popular on college campuses, establishing hundreds of chapters during the decade. Yet, much of the American public looked upon the SDS in an unfavorable light. For many Americans, especially the older generation and those who never attended college, were highly critical of their protests. While the SDS believed they could use their special status to advocate for Americans who could not advocate for themselves, members of the general public instead viewed them as unpatriotic, spoiled college students. This tension escalated as the SDS protests increased in the late 1960s and became associated with other, more radical groups in response to the war.